Welcome to the deep dive.
Mm.
Every single day, I mean, dozens, maybe hundreds of times, we're making decisions.
Mm.
Tiny ones like what shirt to wear, medium ones like what to grab for lunch, and then these huge swirling ones that feel like they could change everything.
Yeah.
We're constantly choosing.
We really are, but the question is, how often do we actually make those choices well?
Yeah.
It's easy to think, if you're smart or experienced or just have good gut feelings, you'll naturally make good calls.
Right. Intuition.
Exactly. But the reality, and this is what's so fascinating in the source material we're diving into, Decisive, How to Make Better Choices in Life and Work, is that even really capable people, they fall into these predictable hidden traps.
Hidden traps. Okay. So our mission here is to unpack the big insights from Decisive, show you why smart folks stumble, and maybe more importantly, give you a practical way to spot those pitfalls and, make better choices yourself.
Absolutely. The authors talk about what they call the four villains of decision-making. These are sort of sleeky biases that just sabotage our judgment.
Four villains.
Okay. And what's really eye-opening is that the classic tool, the one we always reach for, the simple pros and cons list, it doesn't really stand much of a chance against them.
Wait, really? Just weighing the good and bad isn't enough? That
Yeah.
feels like that's what you do?
Oh, we do, yeah, but it kind of leaves you vulnerable. Your gut feeling and just a simple list. They don't build strong protection against these villains. But the good news is there is a process, a structured approach, like a protective layer you can wrap around your decision-making.
Okay, wrap around it. I'm intrigued. Let's meet these villains. What's the first one trying to trip us up?
The first villain is narrow framing. This is basically our tendency to really limit our options. We often boil down a complex decision to just a simple whether or not choice.
Like, should I fire Clive or not? Should we sue the competitor or not?
Exactly. Should I take this job or keep the one I have? It presents itself as this single fork in the road.
The binary trap. Yeah, I see that.
And it's incredibly common, even in big organizations that you'd think would know better. There's this study by Paul Nutt. He looked at 168 major decisions in one company.
Okay.
And get this, a staggering 95% were framed as either whether or not or involved looking at just two options, just two.
Wow, 95%. And how did those turn out?
Not great. Those whether or not decisions. They failed over half the time, 52%. Compare that to only 32% failure for decisions where they actually considered more options.
That's a huge. Just looking for one extra option makes that much difference.
It really does. Narrow framing just blinds you to potentially much better possibilities that are maybe hiding just out of view.
Okay, so that's villain number one, narrow framing. What's the second villain we need to watch out for?
Villain number two is confirmation bias. This is a big one. Once you have an initial idea or maybe just a slight leaning towards something, this bias kicks in. It encourages you to seek out information, interpret stuff, and basically just favor anything that confirms what you already believe or, what you want to believe.
So I start kind of subconsciously looking for evidence that my first thought was right. And I ignore stuff that suggests I might be wrong.
Yes,
Yeah.
precisely. And you even start to notice things differently. Things that fit your assumption jump out, while stuff that contradicts it,
Right.
it just gets filtered out. Think about like a couple having trouble.
Okay.
If one person starts thinking the other is selfish, suddenly they'll only see the selfish acts. It just reinforces that negative idea.
Well, you see what you expect to see.
Exactly. The source material talks about negotiations, too. Asking tough, disconfirming questions can actually signal confidence and get you better info. But it gets tricky when there are power dynamics involved.
Like a doctor and a patient.
Precisely. Doctors are trained to spot patterns, which is obviously good, but it can also mean they might lock onto a diagnosis too quickly, and then they might sort of bias their questions based on that hunch, potentially missing what's really going on. There's this great example, Dr. Barber and a patient named Joseph. Joseph said he was dizzy, but the real issue was profound grief. If the doctor junks in too fast, interrupts, imposes their own pattern, they miss the actual story. Confirmation bias makes us hear what we expect, not always what's being said.
Seeing what we expect, hearing what we expect. Okay, got it. Villain number three.
Villain 3 is short-term emotion. This is when our feelings right now, our gut reactions in the moment, tempt us away from choices that line up with our bigger goals or values.
Ah, yes. The classic red velvet cheesecake dilemma you mentioned.
It's a perfect, if maybe slightly too delicious example. Your immediate desire is just screaming, yes. That massive slice, 1,540 calories, totally worth it.
Echo slightly, yeah.
But your longer-term goals, maybe about health or weight, are saying something totally different. Our gut feelings can get instantly excited about things that just aren't wise for us down the road. It leads to those impulsive choices we kick ourselves for later.
So it's that battle, the craving now versus the consequences later.
Yeah.
And the fourth and final villain.
That's overconfidence about the future. We tend to be, well, just overly optimistic about how things are going to unfold.
I think we've got it all figured out.
Pretty much. We predict a smooth ride, which means we're less likely to actually prepare for problems or even notice the early warning signs when things start to go sideways. There's research by Tetlock showing just how bad humans are at predicting things, even the experts, often worse than simple computer algorithms.
Wow. Okay, so let's recap these villains. We limit our options. That's narrow framing.
Right.
We only look for info that agrees with us, confirmation bias.
Yep.
We let our feelings in the moment hijack us, short-term emotion. And we think we know exactly what the future holds. Overconfidence.
You got it.
No wonder making decisions feel so hard sometimes. And you said earlier, the basic pros and cons list. It doesn't really fight these.
Not effectively, no. Think about it. You can still make a pros and cons list within a really narrow frame, right?
Ah, okay.
The information you put on the list is easily skewed by what you chose to look for. That's confirmation bias again. Right.
Your short-term emotions, they totally influence how much weight you give to each pro and con.
Makes sense.
And it doesn't do anything to address the fact that the future is uncertain. It just assumes you know the outcomes. So, yeah. We need something more robust.
And that's where this WRAP framework from DECISIVE comes in.
Exactly. The source proposes the WRAP framework, W-R-A-P. It's a process, a set of steps designed specifically to counteract these four villains. You can think of it like literally wrapping a protective layer around your usual way of making decisions.
Okay, WRAP. I like that. Lay out the steps for us.
Okay. W stands for widen your options.
Widen options, okay.
R is for reality test your assumptions.
Reality test, got it.
A is for attain distance before deciding.
Attain distance, right.
And P is for prepare to be wrong.
Widen, reality test, attain distance, prepare. WRAP PEC. Okay, let's take them one by one. First up, W widen your options. How do we actually fight that narrow framing? Get out of that whether or not box. The core idea here is pretty straightforward, but powerful. Actively search for more alternatives. Remember that statistic we talked about?
Yeah, the 52% failure rate for whether or not decisions.
Exactly. Just considering two or more options dramatically increases your chances of making a, quote, very good decision. The source offers some really practical techniques for this.
Okay, give us one. What's a key technique for finding more options when you feel stuck?
A really important one is multi-tracking. So instead of looking at options one by one, like, okay, idea A, no. Okay, let's look at idea B, nah. You consider several options at the same time in parallel.
Ah, like comparing them side by side.
Precisely. Companies like Lexicon, the firm that names products like the Pentium chip, they do this constantly. And it's not just about having more choices on the table. Multi-tracking can actually, believe it or not, speed things up sometimes.
Really? How?
Because you're gathering information about multiple paths at once. It also helps keep egos in check. People aren't overly invested in their one pet idea.
Ah, that makes sense.
And it gives you built-in fallback plans if your top choice doesn't pan out. You don't need, like, dozens of options to get the benefit. The research suggests just adding one or two more credible alternatives makes a huge difference.
Okay, multi-tracking. Comparing options simultaneously. What if I feel totally blocked, though? Like there really are no other options.
Yeah, that happens. That's where the vanishing options test is super helpful. You basically ask yourself, okay, imagine my current options just disappeared. Poof. What would I do then?
Force yourself to think outside the current box.
Exactly. There's a story about a manager named Sanders agonizing over whether to fire an employee, Anna. She felt stuck. But when she forced herself to imagine Anna just wasn't available for that specific role anymore, she quickly realized, oh, I could move Anna to a different position where she'd be great and then restructure the front desk. It just breaks that mental logjam and forces you to get creative.
That's a clever mental trick. Okay, so we can generate new ideas ourselves. Where else can we look for options? Steal ideas.
Laugh slightly. Well, find inspiration, maybe. You can find someone who's solved your problem before. Look for bright spots, things already working well inside your own team or organization.
Okay, look internally first.
Yeah. Or look outside at competitors, at best practices in other industries. Like Sam Walton apparently used to travel around just looking at how other stores ran their checkout lines.
Benchmarking, basically.
Right. Or you can look really far afield, look in the distance by finding analogies from completely different domains.
If you mentioned the Speedo designer looking at torpedoes and stuff.
Exactly. That's called laddering up. You take your specific problem, how to make a faster swimsuit, and you ladder up to a more abstract version, how do you move anything fast through water? That kind of thinking can spark really novel solutions you'd never find if you just stayed in your own little pond.
Okay, so widen your options. Multi-track, use the vanishing options test, look for bright spots, look outside, look way outside for analogies. Got it. Now, step 2 are reality test your assumptions. How do we fight that confirmation bias once we have a few options?
Right. So now you have options, but you're still likely leaning towards one. Right. Confirmation bias wants you to just find reasons why that one is the best.
Yeah.
So this step is all about actively seeking out evidence that might disprove your initial belief or show the flaws in your preferred option. You have to deliberately look for the reasons you might be wrong.
Ouch. That sounds uncomfortable. How do you do that systematically?
Well, one powerful way is to consciously consider the opposite. Think about how legal systems work, right? They have opposing sides presenting conflicting evidence.
Prosecution and defense.
Exactly. Or historically, the Catholic Church had the devil's advocate, whose job was literally to argue against sainthood. In a team setting, you could assign someone that role. Your job is to poke holes in this proposal. Or just make a point of seeking out known critics and actually listening to them in a safe environment. You have to fight that natural urge to just surround yourself with yes men.
Deliberately seek out disagreement.
Oh.
What about testing assumptions in the real world, not just debating them?
Yes, that leads perfectly into another key technique. Ooch, before you leap.
Ooch. Like, move a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. Instead of making a huge, irreversible commitment based on your assumptions, you dip your toe in the water. You run a small experiment first.
Like a pilot program.
Precisely. There's a great example of Bill Gross's incubator, Idea Lab. They wondered if people would buy cars online back in the early days. Instead of building a massive website and infrastructure,
What did they do?
they just put up a simple, fake website just to see if people would even click buy. That little ooch gave them real data before they invested millions.
Art.
Another example is John Hanks at National Instruments. He had this idea for wireless sensors for monitoring things like volcanoes. Big potential, but risky.
Yeah.
So he didn't immediately build a whole product line. He found one really demanding customer, someone monitoring the Costa Rican jungle, and did a small-scale test there first. Entrepreneurs often do this naturally. It's like, why guess when you can actually know?
So, test it small, learn, then decide whether to go big. What stops people from ooching?
Often it's that villain again. Overconfidence. They think they already know the outcome, so why bother testing?
Ah, right. Okay, ooching makes sense. And related to getting real data, you mentioned being careful whose information you trust.
Absolutely crucial. This ties into trusting the outside view or base rates over your own inside view.
Okay, explain those terms. Inside view versus outside view.
Your inside view is your personal perspective on your specific, unique situation. My project is different. My team is better. It's almost always overly optimistic.
Right, we think we're special.
We do. The outside view, on the other hand, ignores the specifics of your case and asks, how do things usually turn out in situations like this? It looks at the statistics, the base rates.
So like looking at average restaurant failure rates instead of just believing my restaurant idea is guaranteed to succeed.
Exactly. Or trusting the aggregate TripAdvisor reviews for a hotel over just your gut feeling looking at the lobby photos. Or Kahneman's famous story about predicting how long his curriculum project would take. His team's inside view was wildly optimistic. But the dean, who knew the outside view, the base rate for similar projects, knew it would take much, much longer. And the dean was right.
Wow.
So when you get advice, especially from experts, don't just ask them to predict your future. Ask them about the base rates. What happens typically? That's often more reliable information.
Don't ask, will I succeed? Ask what percentage of ventures like mine succeed. That's a really useful distinction. Okay, so reality testing. Seek disconfirming evidence. Ooch before you leap. Trust the outside view over the inside view. Got it. Next step. A, attain distance before deciding. This is about fighting that short-term emotion, right?
That's right. The goal here is to create some space, some separation between yourself and the immediate emotional pull of whatever you're feeling right now. Anxiety, excitement, frustration, whatever it is.
How do you do that? Just Calm down.
Calming down helps, but it's more about shifting perspective.
Uh,
A really simple but powerful tool the source recommends is the 1-10-10 framework.
1 in 10. What's that?
You ask yourself 3 questions about the decision you're facing. How will I feel about this in 10 minutes? How will I feel about it in 10 months? And how will I feel about it in 10 years?
Okay. Short-term, medium-term, long-term emotional perspective.
Exactly. There's an example of a woman named Annie using this. She was agonizing over whether she should be the first one to tell her boyfriend she loved him. Big emotional moment,
First
right?
shot, definitely.
Using 1-10-10 helped her see beyond the immediate anxiety, 10 minutes, to the potential long-term significance, 10 months, 10 years. It forces you to bring those future emotions, potential regret maybe, or long-term satisfaction into the picture, not just focus on how you feel right now.
That's really practical. It helps you warm out from the immediate emotional intensity. What about the sneakier emotions, the ones we might not even realize are pushing us around?
Good question. That's where it's important to recognize things like mere exposure and loss aversion.
Okay, break those down. Mere exposure.
Mere exposure effect is just our tendency to like things more simply because they're familiar to us, we've seen them before.
And loss aversion is the well-known finding that losses feel way more painful than equivalent gains feel good. Losing $100 hurts more than finding $100 feels great.
Right, okay. And how do those affect decisions?
They both feed into something called the status quo bias, our tendency to just stick with what we know, what's familiar and comfortable, even if changing might be better.
Because the familiar feels safer, mere exposure, and changing feels like risking a loss aversion.
Exactly. The source mentions the early days of PayPal. The founders were apparently quite reluctant to drop their original product, which ran on Palm Pilots.
Wow, Palm Pilots, blast from the past.
Right. Even though the web-based version was clearly taking off and was the future, ditching the familiar Palm Pilot thing felt like a loss. It's worth asking yourself sometimes, how many things we treat as organizational truths are really just familiar ideas we're comfortable with?
That's a challenging thought. Don't confuse familiar with optimal. How else can we get distance? Can we sort of step outside ourselves? Yes, absolutely. You can try to look at your situation from an observer's perspective. Ask yourself, what would someone else advise me to do here? Or even, what would my successor do if they took over tomorrow?
The successor question. Like Andy Grove at Intel.
That's the famous example. When Intel was agonizing over whether to get out of the memory chip business, their original business, Grove asked his CEO, Gordon Moore, if we got kicked out and the board brought in a new CEO, what do you think he would do?
And the answer was clear.
Apparently, the answer was immediate. He would get us out of memories. And Grove said, why shouldn't you and I walk out the door, come back in, and do it ourselves? It just cut through all the history and emotional attachment.
Powerful, okay. And for personal decisions, is there a simpler version of that?
There is, and it's incredibly effective for many people. Just ask yourself, what would I tell my best friend to do? Think about it. When you give advice to your best friend, you naturally prioritize what's most important for them in the long run. You cut through the short-term emotional turmoil that they might be stuck in.
Right, you see their situation more clearly than they do sometimes.
Exactly. And the source notes that when people ask themselves this question about their own dilemmas, they're often surprised by how quickly and clearly the answer comes. It just provides instant distance and clarity.
That best friend question.
Yeah.
I can see how that would work.
Okay.
Okay, so attain distance helps quiet the emotional noise. But even then, decisions can still feel really hard, right? That agonizing feeling.
Absolutely. And the source points out that sometimes that very difficulty, that agony, isn't necessarily a sign you're doing it wrong. It might actually be signaling a conflict among your core priorities.
Core priorities. Okay, this isn't one of the 4 villains, but it's important.
It's crucial for making wise choices, especially the tough ones, even after you've wrestled with the biases. These agonizing decisions often force you to get really clear on your long-term values, your goals, your aspirations. Basically, what kind of person or what kind of organization do you really want to be?
So the tough choices reveal what truly matters most to you.
Often, yes. These priorities aren't always obvious day to day. It's when you face a hard choice, like Kim Ramirez in the book deciding between 2 very different jobs, or the nonprofit Interplast debating whether their core mission was providing immediate surgical care or training local surgeons for a lasting impact. That's when you have to figure out what you really stand for. Defining and ranking these priorities is voluntary, obviously, but it's vital for navigating those tough trade-offs.
And once you know your core priorities, how does that help?
It becomes your compass. You can use them to guide your choices. You might even establish guiding principles or rules for yourself or your organization, like Wayne Roberts did at Dell with things like have a bias for action. These act like guardrails.
Okay.
And importantly, to make space for your core priorities, you often have to actively fight against lesser priorities. Jim Collins talks about creating a stop-doing list.
A stop-doing list. I like that.
Yeah. Actively prune the tasks or commitments that aren't essential to your core mission. Focus on your list A, the critical stuff, and find ways to minimize or eliminate the list B, the energy-draining, less important stuff.
Identify what truly matters, make it your guide, and clear out the clutter. Okay, that brings us to the final step. P, prepare to be wrong. How do we tackle that final villain, overconfidence?
Right. Since we established the future isn't a single point we can predict perfectly, but more like a range of possibilities. This step is all about anticipating that uncertainty and building in contingency plans. Don't just plan for the most likely future, you need to bookend the future.
Bookend it, meaning?
Meaning explicitly consider a range of outcomes, from the very bad to the very good. There's an example of an investor, Byron Penstock, looking at Coinstar stock. He didn't just try to predict the future price. He analyzed it based on two extreme scenarios. What if the company had to liquidate tomorrow, the downside bookend? And what if everything went incredibly well, the upside bookend?
So consider the floor and the ceiling, not just the middle ground.
Exactly. And the source notes that just the act of explicitly considering these bookends actually improves the accuracy of people's predictions. It forces realism.
Interesting. Okay, so think about the range. How do you specifically prepare for the bad end of that range?
That's where you run a premortem. This is a fantastic technique from psychologist Gary Klein.
A premortem, like an autopsy before death.
Chuckles. Kind of. You imagine it's, say, a year in the future, and the project or decision you're considering has failed. Utterly failed.
Okay, good grim, but go on.
Then you ask everyone involved, okay, it failed. What killed it? What went wrong? It's a safe way to surface potential threats, risks, and weaknesses before you even start. The 100,000 Homes campaign used this effectively. It helps you identify those potential failure points and figure out ways to mitigate them upfront.
A premortem to anticipate and prevent failure. I like that. What about the other bookend, preparing for unexpected success?
That's where you run a preparate. It's the flip side of the pre-clip.
Preparate, okay.
You imagine the project succeeded wildly, beyond your wildest dreams. Then you ask, okay, what factors led to this amazing success, and are we ready for it?
Ah, so you don't get caught flat-footed by success.
Exactly. Think about Minnetonka, the company that launched soft soap. It was a massive hit, way bigger than they expected. Luckily, they had run something like a preparate and realized a potential bottleneck was the little plastic pumps for the bottles. They secured a huge supply in advance. If they hadn't prepared for that upside, they could have fumbled their own success.
Premortem for defense, preparate for offense. That's a great pairing.
It really is. And sometimes, even with all this planning, you just need to acknowledge that overconfidence is really hard to eliminate completely. So you add a safety factor.
Like engineers do, building an extra margin for error.
Precisely. Engineers might calculate a cable needs to hold X amount of weight, but they'll design it to hold 5X or even 11X just in case. It's a practical admission that things might not go exactly as planned. Build in a buffer.
Be humble about the future. Okay, and one last piece for preparing. How do we make sure we actually notice when things start to go off track, especially if it's gradual?
That's where tripwires come in. These are predefined signals or conditions that snap you out of autopilot and force you to reconsider your course or make a conscious decision.
Like the low fuel light in your car.
That's a perfect, simple example. It forces you to stop ignoring the situation and decide to get gas. A more colorful one is David Lee Roth's famous "no brown M&Ms" clause in Van Halen's contracts.
Oh yeah, I've heard about that. It wasn't really about the M&Ms, was it?
Not at all. It was buried deep in a complex technical writer. If the band arrived and saw brown M&Ms in the bowl, it was an instant tripwire signaling that the venue probably hadn't read the entire contract carefully, including crucial safety requirements for their massive stage setup.
Wow, that's clever. A tripwire for attention to detail.
Exactly. Zappos offering new hires money to quit after their training. That's a tripwire, too. It forces the employee to make a conscious commitment decision. Am I really in, or should I take the cash? Tripwires are especially useful when change is slow and easy to ignore, or when people are just coasting on autopilot.
Or when you're deep into a project and don't want to admit it's failing. escalating commitment.
Right. Tripwires can help break that cycle. Setting deadlines or partitioning resources, like giving yourself a budget for Vegas slots on multiple swipe cards instead of one big pile of cash, can act like tripwires too. They force decision points instead of allowing passive consumption or slow drift.
Okay, prepare to be wrong. Bookend the future, run pre-mortems and prep-parades, add safety factors and set tripwires. That completes the WORAP framework. Widen options, reality test assumptions, attain distance, prepare to be wrong. Well, it's a really comprehensive process.
It is, and the source really emphasizes that using this framework, these techniques, isn't just about hoping for a better outcome. The way you arrive at the decision, the process itself, matters hugely.
You mean how fair it feels?
Exactly. That's the whole idea of procedural justice. How a decision is made, especially in a group or organization, can be just as important, sometimes even more important, than the actual outcome.
Really? More important than winning or losing?
There are studies mentioned showing exactly that. People who lost a case in court but felt the process was fair were actually more satisfied than people who won but felt the process was unfair or biased.
Wow, that says a lot. So what makes a process feel fair?
It comes down to a few key things. Giving people a voice, actually listening to them, using accurate information, being consistent, avoiding bias, explaining the reasons behind the final decision, and just being candid about trade-offs and uncertainties.
So transparency and respect, basically.
That's a big part of it. It builds trust and buy-in, even when people don't get the outcome they wanted. Sometimes, like Dave Hitz from NetApp suggested, the best way to defend a tough decision is to openly acknowledge its potential flaws and the reasons you made it anyway.
It sounds like if you combine having clear core priorities, knowing what really matters to you, with using this structured wrap process to navigate the villains, that gives you the best shot at making a decision you can really stand behind, whatever happens.
That's absolutely the key takeaway from Decisive. The goal isn't to achieve perfect foresight or guarantee success. Nobody can do that. The goal is to make the best possible choice you can, given the information you have and the inherent uncertainty of the world. And you do that by relying on a solid, thoughtful process, not just gut instinct or a quick analysis. It's about being more deliberate, more aware of the traps, and ultimately, more prepared.
This deep dive has given us so many practical tools pulling from Decisive. So as you, our listener, think about your own decisions, big or small, maybe consider this. Which of those four villains, narrow framing, confirmation bias, short-term emotion, or overconfidence, do you think is most likely to derail your choices? And what's one step, just one technique from the WRAP process that you'll try out this week to start fighting back against it?
Definitely something to mull over until that next big decision comes along.